Hello and welcome to Conversations with Catholics. I am very excited for today's episode because I think that this topic is something that isn't discussed enough. Welcome, Matthew. What's going on?
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so
We'll
much for
we'll
being
get we'll
here.
get plenty we'll get plenty of me talking tonight, so it'll be discussed plenty, I guess.
Okay, well, I'm for one looking forward to it, and some folks in the live chat are already saying that they're looking forward to it. Daniel says he's all in for this one. The Mahayanist mind says that he's interested. I think that this is something that isn't entirely discussed enough, and I'm really glad that you are bringing this conversation to the internet. But before we dive into the meat and potatoes, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and just tell me and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, my name is Matthew. I go by Barbarian most places that I can. I'm not on Twitter, and I don't have any videos on my YouTube. Any videos on my YouTube. I've been wrestling with Catholicism basically my whole life. I was born and raised Catholic. I was born and raised Catholic with an asterisk because my parents kind of fell away prior to me being born and through my first couple of years. I actually can remember my baptism.
Huh.
One of those founding mythologies that we have in our heads. My part of my founding mythology is I can remember wrestling, the baptismal font to try and get away from this very large man in strange clothing trying to drown me. So as I got older, I had questions. I was raised in a homeschool family. I used to say that we were a rad trad family until I found your channel. And now I realize that we were nothing. We ain't got nothing on you guys. But we were homeschooled, and
For the record, I say the same thing about other people that I meet too. So there's like this never-ending cycle. I guess until you get to like the
right,
Diamond Brothers or
right,
whatever. But
yeah.
so I'm sure that your family was plenty rad trad.
Well, compared to I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania. My dad's business took him to Philly and New York, New Jersey, and I would work for his business on occasion, and I would travel into the big city. And I was reading this literature as a child, Outlaws of Razorhurst, right? Like that typifies the young Catholic boys literature. I was reading this literature and I was reading these textbooks which um, presented basically a fight with the secular world, and you are in a battle, you know, for your soul, for the soul of the nation, whatever. Uh, and at the same time, I was still sharing the roads with those dirty, filthy Protestants, and I, there was a cognitive dissonance even from a young age that I was sensitive to. Then, in my high school years, started asking questions. A few of those questions didn't get answered very well. And then I kind of rounded out my traditionalist education with a couple years at Christendom College in
Oh,
Virginia. And that's where I met my wife. And we are married and we have a bunch of kids. So, as far as the traditionalist Catholic side of things go, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to.
the rad trad
Um,
dream.
yeah, more or less. Uh,
Oh, so I lost your audio all of a sudden. Yeah. Um, See if you can get that figured out. In the meantime, I'll go ahead. Take your time. Take your time. I'll let you know when I get the audio back. Um, but yeah. I guess I can. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and stall until you're back. Go ahead and try to fix the audio. Um, I'll share with the audience that I haven't made a whole bunch of videos recently, like not like I guess recorded videos. Um, I've been trying to do like a little bit of reading. I guess I've also just been trying to spend less time on YouTube in general. Um, but something that I have been working on, I guess, is the UFO, which I know is like a weird thing to talk about. Um, but I've been getting into some UFO literature. Let me show you a book. So this book is called Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, and it's by Dr. Jim Madden. Dr. Jim Madden is like the guy who wrote the book on Thomistic philosophy of mind that is like used in seminaries. So he's a real Catholic philosopher, and he wrote a book on the philosophy of the UFO, and I found that like really enticing. Not yet, Matthew. Keep trying. I'll keep stalling.
Oh, well.
Oh, I gotcha. You're back.
Great. I want to say your interview with Jim Madden was excellent.
Thank you.
Really like that. I want to pick up his book.
I'm a huge Dr. Madden fan, so.
Yeah. I'm so sorry about that. You can tell which one of us is not the professional here.
Neither of us. That's the real answer.
So anyway, I guess just to round out my personal biography, the last 10 years, I've more or less, I fell away from regular Catholic practice. The questions that never got answered became too much for me, combined with depression and anxiety and all the typical struggles of the modern day. And it's really only in the last 2 years that I started to think my way back to Catholicism and started to practice again, go back to confession, go back to mass, and so on. And here I am, still weird, but now I'm praying the rosary.
So you said that you grew up in Southeast Pennsylvania. I actually I was actually born in like East Central Pennsylvania. So I was born in like the Lehigh Valley area.
Okay, cool.
And I lived
Chester
in Malvern.
County.
I lived in Chester County.
Malvern's right next to us. Yeah.
No way. Okay. Yeah. So I lived there. When did I live there? 2019 is when I lived in that. It was in 2020. So in 2020, I moved from Chester County, Pennsylvania, to where I'm at now in Kentucky.
Gotcha. Cool.
But yeah, small world. That is funny, and it is like a Catholic area. You also said you went to Christendom College.
Yeah.
It's funny. Almost everybody from my chapel wound up going to Christendom College. If you went to pretty much everyone. If you went to Steubenville, it was because like you were liberal, like you were too liberal. I'm serious. Like,
I'm sure Dr. O'Donnell would love to hear that. Yeah.
And even though we loved people like Scott Hahn and stuff.
Sure. Scott Hahn. Yeah. He's over there. Yeah.
Yeah. But we viewed, like, I don't know why everyone went to Christendom, but we all did. Shout out from Kentucky. What's up, Aaron? I'm in Lexington. I don't know where you're at. But okay, so that was like a little bit of your upbringing. Was there anything else about your upbringing that you wanted to tell us? I know that you've got a couple questions for me, and then I've got some questions for you. Was there anything else about your upbringing that you wanted to go to before you wanted to kind of ask?
I guess I've been thinking recently about, there's a typical dialectic on the internet that's part of the internet argument between atheism and theism, and it's the genetic fallacy. You know, if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu, kind of a thing. I've been thinking about that, and I've also been thinking about how a lot of times in political conversations, but also in religious conversations, people tend to explain and really explain away their opponent's positions by saying, well, you feel that way because of X, Y, or Z horrible thing that happened to you, or A, B, C great thing that happened to you. And I just kind of want to come out in front of everything and say, yeah, no, duh. Like,
right.
Yeah, obviously. Right. So, you know, I was born and raised Catholic. That's why I'm Catholic. My psychology was formed by Roman Catholicism. So that's where else, you know, you have the words of eternal life. Where else are we going to go? That's kind of the way it works for me. And then as far as, you know, I explicitly, in that document that I shared with you, I explicitly say that I'm not really interested in accepting dogmatic decrees without having any opportunity to argue it out, to check the math, so to speak. And the reason for that is because I've lived through narcissistic and people. I've not just in my home life, but also in the workplace. I've experienced egotistical and selfish people who get into a position of power and then just do what they want. And I'm not really interested in tolerating that. So that's the,
And that was your home
that's
environment.
yeah,
That was your home
yeah,
environment growing up. Was a place where there were people with big egos, and there was no room for disagreement. That was the kind of home environment growing up.
yeah. And I don't want to, obviously it's complicated, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, so, Immanuel Kant has this thing of you should never use a human being as a tool for some end. You should always treat human beings as an end in themselves. And at the end of the day, I just wasn't treated like a human being. And it's super complicated, right? It's not that I wasn't provided for. It's not that I wasn't cared for in a particular way. It's just that when it came time to express my personality and explore who I was, to become a person and not just a child, that wasn't really appreciated.
I I think I know what you're talking about. In a lot of so when I read that portion of your essay, I think I actually left a note in there saying I didn't grow up in like an abusive household or anything like that. I didn't. However, I did grow up in like a conformist household where
Hmm.
there was a clear vision of how we were all supposed to be,
Hmm.
and you got to be that way. And if you're not going to be that way, well, then you're going to feel like a ton of social pressure. Um, and I guess I was like the weirdo who just kind of didn't care about the social pressure, and until I guess I did eventually. But I didn't do what I was supposed to do, and then I kind of like I guess I paid the price for it in some sense.
Yes.
So um, yeah, I just want to say that part of your story resonated with me, and I'm looking forward to getting into that a little bit more. I think in the future, but I think you might have been in the middle of something, and if you weren't, I think we were also building towards
No, go
Christian.
ahead.
Okay, well, so I guess if you want to start with kind of like the three questions that we discussed, I know that you said that these are questions that you've been pondering, right? And the first one
Yeah.
was, what is Scripture, right?
Yeah.
Um, so do you want to go ahead and kind of answer that question? What is Scripture?
I would love to. Thank you. We didn't plan this at all, by the way. Um,
Totally organic.
I'm a huge nerd, in the sense that I'm very large and I'm also interested in niche hobbies. I have
Same, brother.
so many books about biblical scholarship, both the popular level stuff from people like Bart Ehrman, but also and Elaine Pagels, but also like Elaine Pagels's peer-reviewed stuff that then gets eventually turned into a popular level
Yeah.
book. Um, and I just finished reading two very interesting and powerful books. Um, the Invention of Religion, Faith and Covenant, and the Book of Exile by Jan Assmann. I know it's insane. That's his name. He's German. And also a book by Thomas Brody, Beyond the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And these two books, I mean, I just happen to have read them recently. You know, give me another couple books, and those will be the most powerful books I've ever read.
Right.
But these books really helped me to focus in on what Scripture is, and then that lets me think about what religion is. But let's stick to Scripture. Um, I just thought of this actually today. I don't know if you've seen the new Dune movie. Dune,
No, I've seen Dune
Dune
Part
Part Two.
1, but I haven't seen Part 2
Yeah,
yet.
me too. And I just started rewatching Dune Part One, and I have all the Frank Herbert books on my Kindle somewhere. Hopefully, it's charging. But I was thinking, I've seeing a lot of memes on social media. Did Dune copy Star Wars? Right? And apparently, there's comments from George Lucas and Frank Herbert, and there's tea, right, as the kids say. Um, and I think that's a really fun conversation. Did Star Wars copy Dune? And one, there's some cool things. So like Dune obviously is a desert planet. Tatooine is obviously a desert planet. Tatooine has two suns. Dune has two moons. Chosen One, prophecy, hero's journey, yada yada. So did Star Wars copy Dune? Well, but to answer that question, let's take a step back. Did Genesis copy Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish? Right? There's flood stories in both. There's a creator god forms the world out of the chaotic waters. There's a main character who wrestles with a pseudo divine figure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did the one copy the other? Well, to answer that question, I have to talk about the Book of Exodus. Eventually, we'll get to the question. We'll answer the question if Star Wars is a ripoff of Dune. What is the Book of Exodus? Well, from our Christian upbringing, if you say Exodus, you think of basically two tens. You think of the 10 plagues, and you think of the 10 commandments. Those are the two tens you think of from a Christian perspective. But for the Jews, it's so much more. For the Jews, it's really their gospel. And I mean that in a technical sense. We Christians use the gospel as kind of the centerpiece of our liturgy. It is the story we tell each other. And it forms the basis of our prayer, our corporate prayer. It's the thing we use to pray. It's the thing we use to relate to God. For the Jewish people, especially in the Second Temple period, that is what the Book of Exodus was. It formed the basis of their liturgy. In the Paschal meal, in the Passover feast, there are parts that are played, much like in our Triduum, where there are parts for the congregation to speak, and there's the first reader, the second reader, the priest, and so on. But this is right out of Jewish practice. This is how they practice it, and the purpose of those parts. Some of those parts are explicitly for the youngest members of the group to pray, and part of it forms a kind of call and response, right? Something, and maybe I should have pulled out the passage from the Faith and Covenant book, but it's something along the lines of asking the child, who are you, where did you come from, what happened, and then the child responds with key elements from the Exodus story. The oldest bit of the Exodus story is the hymn that Moses' sister sings after they get through the Sea of Reeds ordeal. And we think that's the oldest bit because it's in verse. And that indicates that there's an earlier oral tradition, which is then preserved in the composition of the Exodus. And the reason that this is important, that I want to highlight this, is that means that it was recited. That means that it was shared. That means it was corporate prayer. And around that was formed this wonderful story of Israel's liberation from Egypt. And that forms the basis for the identity of the Judahite nation, the Israelite nation. This forms the basis for all the spiritual works that come after. The Psalms, the book of Psalms depends on Exodus, and we use the Psalms in our prayer. So in other words, the Exodus is a liturgy, and it is used as liturgy. And the Jewish people were growing up in a period of time and at a place where that's exactly what the Enuma Elish was. The Enuma Elish was a liturgy. The king of wherever had to perform a liturgy on a yearly basis, drawn from the Enuma Elish, in order to keep the sky from falling down. And we laugh, but we shouldn't, because we do exactly the same thing. We say that we need to go to church, we need to go to mass in order for our immortal souls not to fall away from God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In order to keep our society in good working order, we need to pray properly. That's exactly the same thing. It's just that the priest was the high king, and now we are also part of the priestly vocation. So there's a beautiful democratization that's happening in liturgical practice. So did Genesis copy the Enuma Elish? No, no. It needed to build on the Enuma Elish, but it needed to take it, and it needed to make it something that could then support the Exodus narrative. And that is what the purpose of Genesis is. Does Genesis rewrite or take inspiration from the Enuma Elish in certain respects? Yeah, sure. And that shouldn't be a big problem. I think that to ask if it copied the Enuma Elish is kind of the wrong question, because this is just ancient Near Eastern literature. This is just what it is, right? I'll pause there. Sorry.
Almost like is asking if Star Wars copied Dune might also be the wrong question, because they're both the hero's story, right? Like it's, do they both also copy epic Greek poetry, right? Like
more specifically, they're both 1960s, 1970s sci-fi.
Yeah.
They're part of a literary community. They're part of a literary practice, right? And obviously, I think it's fun to identify the similarities. And I think it's important to recognize the differences. But so the question, did X copy Y? In many cases, sometimes, unless it's outright plagiarism, there's been a lot of plagiarism talk on YouTube recently. Unless it's outright plagiarism, then it's not really an important question.
Yeah, I agree. We had some chat in the we had some conversation in the chat where I don't know if you're familiar with Gloff, but Gloff is a friend of the channel. And Gloff is a Catholic, not trad, but like the kind of Catholic who will go to the traditional Latin Mass occasionally. And so he was saying, well, I wouldn't say copy. Genesis was influenced. And he said all this before you expounded upon it. So I have a feeling that Gloff, and if he gets to this part of the video, I think that he'll
I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
I'm a storyteller, Gloff. Don't crimp my style. Hey, don't step on my toes.
Yeah. And the Mahayanist mind is just agreeing with you, saying, yeah, Near Eastern literature had its own tropes and archetypes and themes. You had two different works from the same like general geographic area and era having similar tropes, archetypes, and themes isn't copying per se. It's just existing kind of in the same milieu, right?
Yeah, and you could kind of apply a free market lens to it, and you could say that these are the ideas, tropes, themes, whatever, that kind of the cream that rose to the top, right? These are the interesting bits that particular culture or the people who were able to engage in the literary time period, the literary art of that time period, found to be useful, powerful, interesting, whatever.
Yeah, survival of the fittest in a way, right? Like these are the stories that were deemed powerful enough that they were written down, right?
Or most useful to the hierarchy.
Yeah, fair enough. So I guess let me ask the question then, what is Scripture?
So Scripture is a canon of works, a collection of writings which are seen to be useful in a particularly powerful sense. They're seen to be liturgically useful. They are sufficiently complex, sufficiently abstract, but also sufficiently grounded in a particular historical, social context that they allow for, spiritual creativity, so to speak, within a larger frame that has been set in stone. So it's something like, the English language is a useful language because we have a vast vocabulary that we're able to use in a huge number of contexts. We're able to do science with it. We're able to play games with it. We're able to write poetry, and we're able to write history and fiction. Well, the liturgies that have come to us, the scriptures that have come to us, are similarly agile. They're able to serve in various radically different contexts. That is what Scripture is, and within an Abrahamic frame, within a Christian frame especially, Scripture is those writings which we use liturgically.
Okay. Okay. So what is religion then? Maybe is that the next question?
Yeah, sure. A couple of years ago, uh, I didn't share this one with you. I wrote another 80-page doc, um, and I really kind of hammered out what I think religion is. I think that religion is a socio-narratival technology whereby we learn who we are, what objects there are that exist, how we can relate to those objects, what we can do with those objects, and how we ultimately achieve satisfaction. I really like this word satisfaction. It comes from Alfred North Whitehead's process and reality, excuse me. He uses it in a very technical sense, but I am not a mathematician like he was. I come from a more literary side of things, and so I like to think of the metaphor of satisfaction. I like to think of the metaphorical uses for technical terms. And for me, satisfaction is a coming to rest, or a an achievement of purpose, or a doing what you're supposed to. You know, basically the eudaimonia of Greek philosophy, for more or less. I can't tell you more because I don't know. I haven't experienced it, right?
Fair.
But that's and the point of religion, the point of religious practice, is to achieve satisfaction.
Would you have ever said that you ever experienced it? Like if somebody asked you, perhaps when you were, I guess, significantly younger and you were like particularly religious, and somebody asked you the satisfaction question, like, have you experienced the satisfaction of religion or something like that? Because I think I would have said yes at one point.
So I think I don't know much about the Islamic tradition. I actually, one of the books that I want to read this year is called The Quran and the Bible, which is this. It's bigger than both the Quran and the Bible, which I don't think is fair. But it's tracing out the similarities between certain books of the Old Testament and the Quran. Within Islamic practice, the recitation of the Quran is there. It is Islam, right? Islam means submission. It means submission to the will of God. It is a posture that informs their daily life and their daily practice. They will say God will it or God willing, and you know they constant. That's just part of the Arabic vernacular. That's how powerful this idea of Islam has permeated the modern Middle East. I think that old adage of pray and work, right, and pray without ceasing, you know, these kinds of ideas. I think that the achievement of the thing is the pursuit of the thing. So to get back to your question specifically, have I experienced that? Yeah, I have experienced moments of satisfaction. Just as an athlete will talk about something called the zone, and the zone is when all the training that you've done fades away and there is only the performance of the art. And that is what satisfaction is. That's the satisfaction that we can experience in this life. And
is it your view that religion exists almost as like a shortcut to get into the zone, so to speak? Like, is it almost like religion is a technology that we can use to get into that zone, that satisfaction zone?
Yeah, I would say that it is a technology to do that. I don't think it's a shortcut.
Oh, yeah, that's
because
the wrong word.
Going with the zone language real quick. There is no zone. There are only zones. So the zone experienced by a soccer player and the zone experienced by a marathon runner or a boxer or a chess player or a,
Yeah, musician or
whatever.
something, right? Yeah.
These are only metaphorically the same. These are only, you know, similar in certain aspects. The practice is necessary for that state of being. You don't get to the zone without knowing how to dribble the soccer ball or knowing how to move the chess pieces or whatever. So religion is a technology to achieve this satisfaction, but it gives us the vocabulary to express what that satisfaction is. And this is important because this kind of touches on the fundamental plurality that we have to deal with. Every religion has its own soteriological, eschatological language. We are not climbing the same mountain. Every religion talks about the beatific vision or the complete surrender to Allah or nirvana or no self or whatever. Every religion speaks about that in a way that is unique to that tradition, and in my opinion cannot be made to comport with all other religious traditions, and in my opinion ought not be made to. That there's this fundamental plurality because there is a plurality of practice. So yeah, that's that, I guess.
Yeah. And so I think that this is going to lead nicely into a question that I have for you. I was planning on saving this question for a little bit later when I was going through the write-up that you sent over to me. But this plurality of different practices, it almost, and this is purposefully like a leading question like this, it almost sounds to me like you're saying that picking one of them and practicing it is going to be more important than the one that you pick. What do you say to that? And is that, I think like the kind of Catholic answers types might refer to that as like indifferentism towards religion, where it's like, well, the actual religion doesn't matter as much as the practice of a religion. So I guess, what is your response there? Is what you were suggesting that any religion will do, in a sense, maybe not any, but
Yeah.
but it will perhaps more than one religion do the trick here?
Well, if this was the 18th century, I might say yes. Spinoza is one of my favorites, and he talks about how all religions, all good religions, or all useful religions, basically preach the same thing. They preach loving kindness, right? They preach a right relationship with God, and they preach loving kindness for your fellow human beings. And now I agree with Spinoza that those are two very common elements of many religions, but I don't think that Spinoza was terribly sensitive to the radical differences. I don't think you can shop around for your religious tradition. I think that you are born into it. I think that you're trained up in it. I think that it chooses you more than you choose it. So I don't, and this is one of those things where I'm sure it would bring comfort to the Catholic Answers crowd that you mentioned to categorize me as being more or less indifferent, right? I'm sure they could figure out a way in which I am more or less indifferent. No, I think that we can all get along. If that's what you mean by indifference, then sure. But I do think that as I say in that write-up that I sent you, and as I've constantly been thinking about for the last several years, there is such a thing as a live option. There is such a thing as something which your society presents to you and your psychology responds to. And that's not going to be, there's no one size fits all.
And what do you make of converts? So I know Catholic YouTube is full of converts, mostly I think from Protestant sects to Catholicism. I mean, just think about
Sure.
all of the big name apologists, right? Like Trent
Yeah.
Horn is a convert.
I
Jimmy
wish they'd
Akin.
shut up.
But
These freaking foreigners coming to our
that's right.
our,
I know.
our
What are we gonna do with
Catholicism.
them? But
Um,
seriously, like so, if the idea is that you are born into it, and to some extent, I agree with that. Like I'm never not going to be
mm,
Catholic in the sense that I was born into Catholicism, and even if I don't practice anymore, there's still going to be. It's almost like being American. I can move to a different country. I'm never going to stop being American. I can
right.
stop practicing Catholicism, but it's not going to make me not Catholic. I agree. I
Yeah.
just don't know if a lot of other people will agree. If you know what I
No,
mean.
I think that's the natural question. What about the converts? Yes. So I guess fundamentally, yes, there's going to be converts. Human beings are living organisms. A feature of living organisms is change. We can change our social environments. We can change who we are. We can change the media we consume, etc. I would question how much they actually converted, though,
Hmm.
because, like, using your example of being an American, moving to a different country, but still being an American, one of the recent social media trends was talking about these are the things that all Americans do, and you can always tell who's from the U.S. because they do these things, right? You can take the U.S. You can take me out of the U.S., but you can't take the U.S. out of me. I've eaten too much of it. Um, the I think that the convert will find a way to engage in the new practice in a way that is comforting, in a way that relates back to their old practice. And I would humbly suggest that a lot of apologists are motivated by the same kind of Protestant evangelical impetus. And a lot of the apologists are motivated by a particular kind of rationalism whereby they need to present rigorous arguments and they need to talk about, and they came to Catholicism in part because they felt it was a much more robust intellectual tradition, right? And it was more interesting to defend, right? Now, I think that is a way that Catholics practice their Catholicism. I don't want to say that they're not authentically Catholic, but I don't know if we've taken the Protestant out of them uh, so much.
I mean, yeah, I don't think I disagree, and I don't want to be uncharitable here, but I do think that there's a certain amount of Catholic YouTube that is the way it is expressly because everybody is a Protestant convert to Catholicism. Like,
Well,
do you know what I mean?
and you have to understand there's a lot of anti-Catholic shit in the US. There is a surprising amount of anti-Catholic stuff in the US. I just got finished reading Bible Nation by Kadena Moss and I forget who her co-author was, but it was an examination of the Greens of Hobby Lobby fame, and they opened the Museum of the Bible. Kadena Moss is a critical scholar of the Bible. She's also from the Catholic sphere, and she's doing this very neutral analysis of the Greens' activity. And she gets to the last chapter and she's like, "Look, guys, this is kind of just anti-Catholic through and through." And she's very gentle with it, and she says this is a rather subtle anti-Catholicism, yada yada. But I think it's telling that, and it's hard to overstate the impact that the Green family had on the collection of biblical manuscripts and their potential impact on the story of the Bible in America. I don't know. I've had people knock on my door and tell me that I'm not really Christian. I've like there's a lot of anti-Catholic stuff, and so the apologists wanting to defend that, wanting to no, actually we are Christians, right? Like it's organic. It's organic. I'm not saying that it's a facade.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think that I don't think that Trent Horn is not authentic.
Yeah.
I think that
Right.
we
Right. Right.
see his authentic self on YouTube.
Sure.
I do just think though that like that style of Catholicism that we see so much on YouTube is expressly a result
It's a
of the
particular.
yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
particular kind of Catholicism and one that is very much so influenced by the fact that all of its members are Protestant converts.
And they would like to see themselves as the heirs of Aquinas. They're not even the heirs of G.K. Chesterton. And I think that you do a very good job, by the way. One of the reasons I reached out to you was because I really appreciate the way that you maintain joy and you
Well, thank you.
maintain charitability. So I don't want to put these words in your mouth, but I don't have much respect for apologetics generally. So, but I guess I should leave it there. I'm not going to tempt you. I'm not going to
this this
ruin
is
your chances.
this is what I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. I'm also not sorry. Yeah, I just the word that I like to use is frustrated. I get like very frustrated with like the kind of um apologetics. The apologetic industrial machine is very frustrating. I'll leave it at that.
Yep.
Um
I like that. Yeah. I think I know where you got that phrase. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
so
No.
I actually haven't read that book. I forget what book it's from, but I was doing an interview with an ex-Catholic, James from James Interviews, and he used that phrase, and it's from a book that I haven't read, but I'm a poser and I'm going to keep using it.
Well, I got it from Digital Gnosis. He does the Bad
Oh,
Apologetics YouTube series.
okay, okay.
Uh,
I bet you that
so,
James got it from like the same place that
yeah.
Nathan from Digital Gnosis got it from, probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, I have a bunch of questions for you related to, and if it's all right with you, I'll read sections of your essay out loud. Um,
Yeah. Just to be clear, I really didn't mean this to be required reading or even the basis of this conversation. I just wanted to give you a fair warning as to how weird I am. That's the only reason I sent this to you.
I'll have you know that I did not view it as required reading. I viewed
Okay,
it
good.
as reading that. So truthfully, I started reading it telling myself like, "Hey, look, Matthew told me that this is not required reading, so I'm going to read the first couple pages or whatever, and if I want to keep reading, I will, and if I don't want to, I won't."
Yeah.
And I read the whole thing.
It's 21 pages, guys. I'm so sorry. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry.
So, um do you mind if I put some of it on the screen, just like select quotes of it on the screen?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Cool. So let's see. Can I go like that? Yeah, that looks all right, doesn't it? Actually, no. Now it's going to start. Nah, I can just read it. That's all right. Um, so there's a good number of quotes in here that I would like to kind of read out loud. But my underlying question that I would like to pose to you now, but then not ask for an answer until the end is, how is this different than agnosticism? Okay, so don't answer that question now. And I think part of the answer is it's not, but I'm gonna let you kind of respond to that. So, um, I'm going to read a quote from the beginning. So this is from page 2. You say, "My belief is A, selected and delivered for me by a social world wherein all items of knowledge must find a practical use. B, internally arranged so as to deliver satisfaction by standards fitted to my personal psychology. And C, held independently of any questions of objectivity to which we might aspire." Held independently of any question of objectivity to which we might aspire. Wow, that's like, I read that and I think that is a very agnostic admission. Am I misreading that? Or yeah, tell me, I guess, a little bit more about that, because when I read held independently of
Mhm.
any question of objectivity to which we might aspire, I think to myself like, yeah, we're kind of putting objectivity to the side for now, and we're taking these beliefs for what they are. And to me, that that
Um,
that is agnosticism.
yeah. William James he wrote the book on pragmatism. He kind of stole it from Charles Sanders Peirce, but whatever. We're not going to litigate ancient tea from the turn of the 1900s. He has this thought experiment where he talks about a mountain climber, climbing a mountain, and he comes to a particular gap. And for whatever reason, he needs to continue his climb. Um, and he doesn't know if he can make the jump. And so William James pauses and he asks us, is it better for the climber to believe he can make the jump, or is it better for him not to believe he can make the jump? We don't know until he jumps. obviously. But which do we think? Which does our intuition think will yield better, higher rate of success? And William James, he has the way that the hypotheticals in philosophy work is you set them up in order to necessitate the answer you want.
Right.
So of course the answer is it'd be better to psych yourself up and make you think you can make the jump in order so you jump. So the again, it's a hypothetical in philosophy, so it's bullshit. But it tells us something. It tells us something about human belief, mainly that it's rooted in human practice. Here I stand, I can do no other. Right? Like this is just. I have to make choices. I have to do things. I have to move through the world, and I'm going to hold to these things as if they were true. I think so. That's kind of the pragmatic ground on which I stand. Then, when it comes to this word objectivity, we get in a lot of trouble, I think, with this word objectivity. I don't really mind talk about objectivity because I don't really see it. I think that when some people hear the word objective, they think of eternal, and I don't think that that's a necessary implication of the word objective. So in the case, let's just the word objective to me, it refers to a particular item within the language game that is objective in relation to other objects within that language game. So a very specific example is in court law. The Constitution is objective when it comes to court law. The precedent is objective when it comes to court law. Does that mean that they're eternal? Not really. They can be amended. The Constitution can be amended and precedent can be overturned, right? But those are the objects that are treated as if they are solid and that we all need to orient ourselves to, right? You need to respect something that is objective. You need to be responsive to something that is objective. But that doesn't mean that this objective thing can't change. I guess another anecdote from William James. William James asks us to think about a squirrel running around a tree. And so every time, the squirrel is going to be on the opposite side of the tree from where you are. And if you walk around to the side of the tree that the squirrel's on, the squirrel's going to run to the other side again. And William James asks us, are we going around the tree or is the tree going around us? Right? Now, I don't know jack shit about physics, but I think that most physicists would say it could be either. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to model. It just depends on what question you're trying to answer. So.
Yeah, hey, from a physics, I'm also not a physicist. My degree is in chemical engineering, so I took a decent amount of things like fluid flow and heat transfer. So I took like physics type courses, but I'm not a physicist. But I can confirm that all motion is relative. So, so
yeah, and I think taking relativity seriously. I think it's John. No, is it Dewey? It's either Dewey or Rorty that had this really powerful line where he was talking about how we need to take Darwin seriously. We need to take relativity seriously. We need to take Galileo seriously. And what he meant by that was not that we need to take the dude Galileo seriously. He was talking about how the fact that their insights changed the paradigm. And we need to be responsive to that. We need to take that seriously, and that needs to permeate many fields of our practice, maybe not all fields of our practice. So relativity is, I think, your concept of objectivity needs to update in the face of relativity.
Yeah. We've used empiricism to radically shake how we ought to kind of view the world, right? And I think that like relativity, it's only 100 years old or whatever, but
right.
Like I think that after you find out that relativity is true, like that has to impact the way that you kind of view the world. So, okay, I've got another one for you. This next one is just something that resonates with me, but then I have a question based off of it. So on page 3, you say, In epistemological considerations, I am forever skeptical and prone to following previously unknown threads in an attempt to root out uncertainty, or at least to assuage my intellectual anxiety. A little further on, you say that you're committed to a principle of human dignity that understands no person is free if they are unduly reliant on another. I think calling back to kind of the environment that you were raised in.
Right.
So first of all, I think a large part of why I have a YouTube channel is because I am also following previously unknown threads in an attempt to root out uncertainty or at least assuage my intellectual anxiety. So I think a large reason why I have this channel in the first place is exactly what you said there. So that just kind of really resonates with me. And then the part that you said about you're committed to the principle of human dignity that understands that no person is free if they are unduly reliant on another. So, agree. That's easy for me to do, though. Although I have a question for you here. I think a lot of Catholic social teaching wouldn't define freedom that way. It would be something along the lines of like freedom is like the ability to follow the good. So I guess I have a question for you. So are you committed to a principle of human dignity that would be compatible with the idea that like people should be free to get gay married and stuff like that? And the reason I ask is because the way that I read your sentence, it seems like the answer is yes. But a lot of Catholics would say like, no, there is no such thing as a freedom to be gay because freedom is only like something that allows you to tend towards the good, and it's not good to be gay. Therefore, it's impossible to be free to be gay, if that makes sense.
So that is a complex formulation that is handed down to us from Thomistic metaphysics, which I don't really give a shit about. I do think in terms of potency and act. My psychology is formed by Catholicism, so I still have a lot of Thomistic, baggage.
Right.
But I'm not really interested in cashing out human freedom in that way. So in a lot of ways, I guess I don't really have an answer because that's not how I think about it. But I will kind of sketch out this human dignity thing. So I think that assigning someone dignity, it needs to reflect what Scripture tells us. So we have this high-minded ideal of human dignity. What the hell does that mean? So what do? As Catholics, we look to our liturgical practice, we look to our scriptural basis, and we try to find anecdotes about what that human dignity looks like. And what we find is God being radically permissive. We find God being extremely, radically, incredibly, some would say immorally permissive, right? God being this all-powerful creature, or not creature, all-powerful creator, which nonetheless allows the Holocaust to happen. I think that it's an interesting. I can't help but psychologize the person who insists that gay marriage should be illegal, but is okay with the fact that God didn't intervene to stop the killing of 6 million Jews on the basis of their ethnicity, or is not willing to intervene in any of the horrendous activity that we see today. I do think that's interesting. It's not nice to psychologize your opponents, but I gotta wonder what's going on there. And then the other thing I would say is that I don't think I'm too far off from authentic Catholic social teaching. When you look at one of my favorite things to bring up, and this is just an anecdote, and the actual case is far more complicated, but the Italian bishops were in favor of decriminalizing prostitution and making it legal.
Are you talking about like in the time of Thomas Aquinas? Like, are we talking like 12th century Italy? Because I remember Aquinas writing about prostitution specifically and whether it should be legal or not in the Summa.
No, this was recent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
recent politics. It was either the 80s, 90s, early aughts,
Okay.
somewhere in there. Right? And the Italian bishops were like, yeah, make it legal. And it was from a perspective of harm reduction. I'm not saying that they were saying to make it legal because prostitution is cool. I'm saying they were saying to make it legal because it was the best of the possible options. There were human trafficking concerns. There were concerns that prostitutes would not they would not interact with the police because they were themselves were illegal. When you make a whole category of person illegal, they tend to allow themselves to be victims of all kinds of heinous crimes that they shouldn't be victims to. So, that's also important. Human dignity means not cutting people off from society, because when you do that, then they don't get access to education, they don't get access to healthcare, they don't get access to the goods and services that the rest of us literally take for granted. Me as a white dude, I take for granted a whole hell of a lot of things. I don't have to have the talk with my boys, right? And human dignity demands that that same level of taking things for granted be granted to all of my fellow citizens.
I have absolutely no complaints with anything that you just said. I think that's I wish all Catholics were like that. Speaking of Catholics, on page 4 you wrote, so this is after several pages worth of you kind of giving us some of your thoughts. You say, now
of me blathering on.
So, but I laughed out loud at this part. I really did. I laughed out loud. You say, now, ironically, I profess Catholicism of the Roman flavor. And then you keep going, what's ironic? Like, I just think it's very funny that you say, now, ironically, I am Catholic. Why is that ironic? What made you put the word ironic into that sentence? Instead of just I am Catholic, you said, ironically, I am Catholic.
Yeah. Well, actually, there was a story that was published in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was the Wall Street. It was either Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. They're all the same thing.
Sure.
It was in the newspaper. I read it on my phone on the news app. It was this long article about the Vatican's prosecution of, and I don't know, Cardinal Italian name, who was in charge of the Vatican Bank, and he was implicated in some unsavory things. And this article was going into how the Vatican was prosecuting this person. And I basically came away from reading that article thinking to myself, I don't think this cardinal is like innocent, but this case should have been thrown out. And it should have been thrown out merely on the basis that Pope Francis can't keep his freaking mouth shut. He completely interfered with the prosecution of this cardinal, and the cardinal's going to be in house arrest in the Vatican, right? So it's not like he's not like on death row. The Pope isn't killing anyone,
right? Not anymore.
But what we have in Francis is a personality run rampant, and like this is why we don't do kings anymore, is because the kind of person who would get to be king, the kind of person who would get to be president, the kind of person who would get to be pope, is a charismatic and very opinionated and has a very high opinion of themselves. And I don't think that that's a good thing. I think that we shouldn't have that. I don't think absolute monarchies are cool. And everybody talks about how Pope Francis is the woke pope. Pope Francis is the progressive pope. And I don't think that that's the case at all. Because I made the comparison between him and Trump in 2016. I don't know. I say a lot of things, so I don't know if my wife remembers me saying this, but it was very prescient of me. And I just really realized that, holy shit, Pope Francis is running his mouth and he's saying things out of turn. And so is Donald Trump. And everybody loved Donald Trump because he tells it like it is. And everybody hated Pope Francis because he told it like it is, but I don't like it, I guess. I actually like due process. I actually like having experts. I like an independent judiciary. I like prosecutorial independence and the rights of the accused and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So it's ironic in the sense where you don't like the way it's set up. You wouldn't prefer to set up your own government that way.
No. I think it's a quote that's attributed to St. Catherine of Siena. I think I'm Catholic in spite of the bishops, not because of them.
And the Mahayana's mind says he's ridiculously autocratic when you go against his policies too. So I have to admit I'm not super keyed in on like, the politics of Vatican City, but I do remember hearing grumblings like this too, which is like weird
Yeah.
because, I feel like the media paints him as like, oh, look, it's Papa Francis, and he's very, kind and stuff, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well,
I'm not an expert here.
I should stress, I do think he is a nice person. I just think he's a family man, and by that I mean mafia. And that, like, if you're in, you're in. But if you're my enemy, I take away your food and your drink and your rent, which is what he famously said recently about one of our bishops that got. I think he's been defrocked. I'm not sure, but at any rate, like, arbitrariness is bad, no matter who is suffering. It just so happens that the trad side of Catholicism is suffering at the hands of at the whims of the absolute monarch. And it's a little bit ironic they're being hoisted by their own petard because they're the ones that really wanted papal infallibility to be to be established, and they wanted to go against modernity and establish the king and all that shit. And it's a little bit ironic, but still, we shouldn't let them suffer just because we don't like them.
Someone says the trads would love Francis if you were conservative. Yeah,
Possibly.
yeah, I think so. If the guy in power was doing things that they liked, then they would think it's a great idea that he has so much power. But
That's possible. I think that kind of hypocrisy is very common to the human condition, and I guess because I might be too condemnatory of Francis because I'm attempting to correct for what I see as a possible, vector of hypocrisy.
yeah, I've got a question for you about mysticism. So a decent part of your essay was on mysticism, and I'm trying to see if the audience will be able to actually read along with me. Give me 1 second. I'll see if I can get that in. And there we go. That probably looks fine. Some of the reasons why I wish to raise up the empirical and denigrate the mystical should be obvious from what I've already said. A private revelation does not allow access to those who do not have or cannot attain the experience that precipitated it. Thus, its normative force is either to be accepted or rejected, not subject to the results of inquiry. And I wrote, yeah, I agree. The mystical it can be very frustrating in the sense that I don't have access to anyone else's mystical experiences. So while I am totally cool with the mystical playing a role in your own personal like beliefs and stuff like that, whenever we start talking about legislating, and I'm using that in like a very wide sense of the term, but whenever we start talking about legislating based off of mysticism, I get very frustrated. And it would seem that the entire book of Revelation is mysticism, right? Like there's a large portion of Catholicism is mysticism. And it seems like you kind of share my frustration here. You do, let me scroll down a little bit here to say, before we get too comfortable with reduction, however, you'll hasten to add that any attempt to add a theory of religion must include room for mystical methods of religious knowledge. But then even then you go on to kind of talk about how mystical knowledge and mystical practice, you kind of say, are kind of like the same thing. So I read all this and I agree. But I just kind of view that as a good reason to kind of drop the mystical stuff and only stick with the empirical stuff. And I don't think that you go quite that far. So can you tell me a little bit, like you see the same frustrations that I do, you just don't get as frustrated as I do, I guess. Tell me a little bit more, I guess, about your views on mysticism and the proper role of mysticism and stuff like that.
So I like you pointed out Revelation. It's kind of funny that for Catholics the Bible ends with a big "and what does it mean?" Like that's kind of funny. Yes, mysticism is very frustrating when it is used as the basis of dogmatic command. I think that what is at the heart of Abrahamic practice is, and again, I'm no expert on Judaism, but there's this thing called midrash where I think it basically means interpretation, where a bunch of dudes get together and they argue about what does it mean. And like that's just that's not on the outskirts of Judaic practice. That's just part of Judaic practice. Um, I think that mysticism can serve as an invitation to start talking, to start thinking, to start interrogating the text and relating your personal experience to the text. I think mysticism is an important part of liturgy because liturgy is a training up of your mind to have a particular memory. And mysticism, and I haven't figured out exactly what I think mysticism is, but I think that mysticism at this stage, and I hesitate to say this, but I think that mysticism is basically just experiencing the present moment from that liturgical frame. I think that mysticism is just having a vivid liturgical memory, having that memory come alive in you. And to put it in a more, orthodox language, seeing the face of Christ in the other, being present, feeling the presence of the Holy Spirit, or something like that, right? I think that's what mysticism, I don't want to say boils down to, because I don't think it can boil down too much. I think it is actually a complex production of the vocabulary of whatever practice you find yourself in.
Yeah.
So yeah,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
so I would like us to see mysticism as an invitation to experience with the tradition.
Yeah, I'm cool with absolutely everything that you just said there. Um, I love the idea of mysticism being just like being present and stuff like that. Like I think that's fantastic, and I don't think that any one religious tradition can claim that they have a monopoly on mysticism. If we're defining mysticism in this broad enough sense where we're talking about kind of like being in the present moment and stuff like that. Like in fact, I think that totally secular, non-theistic meditation can get people to be like far more present than no meditation at all. And that's completely secular, like no religion needed in that sense.
Yeah. And we talked about the zone earlier too. I think that
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a similar thing.
Being in the zone is being present too. Yeah. So I guess my question here then is, if it's the case that no religion has a monopoly on the mystical, does that lead us to the conclusion that no religion should be legislating? And by legislating, I do mean governments in theocratic societies, but I also just mean dogmas and stuff like that. Should we not be creating dogmas based off of mysticism? Should the only dogmas be empirical, if we have dogmas at all?
Yeah, and by empirical, in the sense that I use it in the essay that you're reading from, I basically just mean public, open to public comment, more or less. And there's obviously other markers of it, but that's the sense. Because I know you identify yourself as an empiricist, is that right?
Yeah,
So I don't really mean that when I'm
yeah,
using the word. Yeah, I guess to some extent, and again, I haven't really teased this out. A lot of what I'm thinking about is an attempt to transition, I guess you could say. I think that the Catholic Church is in a moment where we, I'm going to say that we decided we lost the war with modernity. Maybe we didn't decide that, but I think we did. I think we lost the war with modernity. Democracy's here to stay, and so we have to start taking that seriously. And I think that kind of requires us to rethink rethink our how we determine the rules of our communities, which are those dogmas and doctrines. And this is why I try to develop the language of the empirical knowledge and the mystical knowledge. The mystical knowledge being private experience and those intuitive leaps that you make when meditating upon your private experience. And the empirical knowledge being the stuff that you ask other people about. Like, hey, what do you think this means? Hey, what do you think that means? And then together you come up with an idea. I do think that certainly no religion should be setting the laws for any nation. I think that human dignity requires that we come together as equals and create a good, just, democratic society. And as far as dogma and doctrine goes, I liked the conversation that you had with Essential Catholic, I think, where he said something along the lines of, we need to radically rethink the concept of sin. That wasn't the most recent conversation. I haven't had a chance to watch that, but that was the conversation prior.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that we should also have that radical rethinking of dogma and doctrine. We need to think about what that is. Are these the rules of a social club, or are these the rules that can get you kicked out of heaven? And what how does that what effect does that have on our societies? You know, that kind of thing.
Amen is all I can say to that. I mean, yeah, I think a radical rethinking of sin and dogma would do wonders for the Catholic Church. Speaking of things that I agree with you on, here is something that I wanted to. So I left a comment that says, "If this is the goal of religion, then count me in." That's how much I appreciated this little sentence right here. So, it doesn't exactly say, but so the very project of defining religion or rounding out the phrase religion is, so like the project of religion is to provide vocabulary for describing the suffering of others in such a way that my spiritual project becomes wrapped up in alleviating their suffering. That sounds to me like, that is the project of like Doctors Without Borders, and that like every charity group is trying to like the project of all these different charities is to alleviate other people's suffering too. And if that's what we mean by religion, then count me in. Now I don't know that this is a super common definition for like if you asked, I'm so sorry, Trent, if you asked Trent Horn what religion is, I don't think that his answer would be exactly what this is here. That what is the project of religion? It's to provide vocabulary for describing the suffering of others in such a way that my spiritual project becomes wrapped up in alleviating theirs. So I guess. Do you think that definition that you propose here is uncommon, but you don't care that it's uncommon? You just think it's like, you're not saying this is common. You're saying that I think the world would be a better place if we all thought that way. Because if that's your position, then I agree. But yeah. What about all that stuff?
So part of what I'm doing goes back to, I mentioned Spinoza earlier. Spinoza saying that all religions are nothing more than the practice of loving kindness, right? And so, in a sense, I'm part of a long tradition of dirty, dirty heretics that respect religion too much to completely call for its dissolution, right? I think better of Catholics than Catholics do of themselves sometimes. I think that the last bit of the essay that I shared with you is actually a piece of writing that I wrote a year ago at this point, a religion and social diffidence. It was a really nuanced idea that hit me like a load of bricks, and it took me a long ass time to work it out. And I hope it made sense. I don't know if you read it, but the point is that I think Trent Horn, and I'm using him because you brought him up. I don't know jack shit about Trent Horn.
I think that I just pick on him.
Yeah, we love you, Trent.
We do. I owe him several beers.
um, anyway, I think that every single Christian Catholic apologist in the world would agree that everybody deserves, good things and nobody deserves bad things. They might do some Thomistic tap dancing, like you described earlier, about how you can't really want a bad thing, and so whatever. But I think that if you sat them down and you showed them a picture of a starving child, every single one of them is like, yeah, feed the starving child. I think what happens in practice is we tend to justify one of the things that we use religion for, one of the things that we use religious dogmas for, is to explain away the suffering of others. Oh, well, they're suffering because they're gay. The AIDS crisis was because they're gay. That's just God, judging the gay people. I thank goodness I haven't heard anyone say this, but I can easily imagine certain types of people dismissing the plight of the Palestinian people.
Oh no, I lost your audio again. I don't know what happened. Hopefully you're able to fix it as quick as you were last time. You were quick on the draw. Let's see if we can get that again. You go ahead and so nothing yet. Oh, gotcha. You're back.
Unbelievable. All right. I guess I should stop.
That's showbiz, baby.
So we one of the things religious dogma is used for is to define categories of people who are engaged in certain activities that we condemn, and therefore we can explain the suffering that they are experiencing, and we don't have to worry about them. You notice this with the Black Lives Matter movement. I've had in real life conversations where I was talking about how, I kind of think George Floyd was murdered. And the guy was like, he was a thief. I'm like, so?
Both of those things can be true.
Yeah, maybe, sure. I think he was murdered. But you can clearly,
one is not mutually exclusive of the other, is all I was going to say.
Right. As if it's acceptable for agents of the state to summarily execute
judge, jury, and executioner. Yeah.
Goofiness. But that is the result, and that struck me. I didn't know what to do with that, and I spent years thinking about it, and I think I finally answered it. We come up with language games to separate off their suffering, and to say that's justified because of whatever, because of either their activities or their beliefs. So what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to say that we should do the opposite. We should see it as a duty to identify ourselves in the other. So something from the Baha'i faith, real quick, is this term remembrance. The Baha'i faith, they love this word remembrance. It's all over their prayers. It's all over their writings. Remembrance, 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 remembrance. Well, Christianity has a term that I think we should use just as often, and it's recognition. Recognition is a term which is seen in the New Testament a lot. I think in the epistles a lot. You were able to recognize Jesus. The Jews at the time were said to not recognize Jesus, leaving aside the anti-Semitism there. But we ought to recognize the imago Dei in the other. We ought to recognize the face of Jesus in the suffering of the poor, and we ought to advocate for the marginalized, because that's where we see Jesus.
Hey, I'm, like I said earlier, sign me up for that. I legitimately, I don't say that like ironically. I really do mean it. And I wish that more religious people kind of shared the idea that was the project of religion, instead of, I think a lot of people view it almost as like a sport where like they're rooting for one and they're rooting against the other. On
YouTube, I think that's true.
Yeah. And speaking of like the Baha'i stuff, Daniel says that he thinks that True Catholicism, universal, was Baha'i before Baha'i. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
You two would
that
get along, you and Daniel. You guys see a lot of
I
stuff the same way.
I dallied with the Baha'i for a bit, and that was what brought me back to Catholicism
Really?
because I just couldn't make it work, and the prospect of learning Arabic so that I could properly engage with the Quran, or learning Persian so that I could properly engage with the half of the Baha'i writings that are in Persian, that was just too much. And I was like, I already know a little bit of Latin. Why don't I just go back, you know, and then just, do the Catholic thing? Why not just do that? So,
Cool. Um, I know that I've kept you for an hour and a half already. I've got a few more questions for you, if that's all right. I don't know if you've got a
yeah,
time limit. Um, there was a
no, I'm up till midnight. So,
Okay, cool, good. There was a tongue-in-cheek comment at one point that I want to ask you a question about. So this is kind of like when you said ironically, that you said ironically I'm Catholic. Same kind of question here. I sometimes I notice like little language things and I'm like, what did you mean here? So you write, occasionally we invent a bureaucratic technology to alleviate the issue. The long list of Catholic churches in union with the Pope with otherwise distinct practice, scripture, and etc. And I wrote, oh no, my Melkite friends are going to be very sad. So do you imply here that certain Catholic sects may as well not even be Catholic? And here I'm thinking of like there are Eastern sects that kind of just completely ignore the Pope. And I think to myself, like, aren't you just Orthodox, but like you just call yourself Catholic? Um,
yeah.
and and what So I guess the question is, why did you put, I'm not putting any words into your mouth, why did you put quotations around in union with the Pope?
So that's from my Catholic upbringing. My Roman Catholic upbringing. I was told that Roman Catholics are the best because we have the most people, who follow the Pope and so on and so forth. And I don't know if that's how those communities would describe themselves. And I think that we should probably defer to what the story that they tell about that. And that's I wasn't. It sounds like I wasn't too far off the mark because you're telling me that there's some rights that more or less just don't pay attention to what the Pope says. That sounds nice. Can you imagine? I can't imagine. That's not what we do. But yeah, I think that there's a bit of number fluffing that happens.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So as in like you think that Catholics might be a little bit more inclusive than they otherwise would be for the strict purpose of being able to count certain like Christian sects
Yeah.
as within the fold, even when they're not.
Yeah. Why are certain churches part of the communion when Anglicans aren't?
Actually, that's a really good
What
question.
the necessary and sufficient conditions, which, and this gets back to the problem with objectivity itself and definitions in general, of course. But it's like, I think that it would be very fruitful for modern Catholics to examine the reasons why these things happened. And what you'll find is that there are more differences within those churches that are said to be in union with the Pope than there are between this broad umbrella of Catholicism and certain so-called Protestant denominations. And I think that ultimately the only rational, reasonable explanation at the end of the day is because of a particular set of politics at a particular point in time, which got solidified over the course of the centuries. And now you've got a Lutheran tradition, which is distinct from a Catholic tradition. And so now it's a problem. Whereas there is no competing Malachite tradition or what have you, right? And so the Roman Catholics can say, yeah, they're part of our team. They can't say that about the Anglicans, for instance.
Some in the chat are saying stay tuned for full Anglican communion. Maybe, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think so. I just don't think so.
I may have been more optimistic about that. Well, I guess not for the Anglicans as much for the Orthodox, but do you hear the news about how like the Orthodox communion talks have kind of collapsed? It was just like a few days ago or something.
Oh,
Um,
that's a shame.
yeah.
That's
So
a shame.
apparently it's all about fiducia supplicans. Like apparently the Orthodox Church is just kind of throwing a hissy fit over the church
Holy
saying,
crap.
yeah, they like I guess like a whole bunch of different Orthodox churches kind of all got together and said like, hey, look, let's cut off conversation with Rome about reunion over fiducia supplicans,
That's
and
frustrating.
so they did. Yeah,
I really liked that pastoral letter from a liturgical standpoint because it highlighted something, it highlighted part of the tradition that I hadn't really been sensitive to before, and that is the Book of Blessings. And I think that that's a beautiful part of our liturgical practice, which I think the Pope did a great job of highlighting. Um, I'd have to like double check, but like there were just like a couple paragraphs that were the gay, and then the rest of it was more or less just about the role of blessings in pastoral care.
yeah. So it's funny when people talk to me about fiducia supplicans, my response is generally like, look, I think it's way too little and way too late to actually make a difference to
No, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so I don't. Yeah, I shouldn't. I won't dwell on that topic, but yeah, I don't know if I understand the angle that Rome is kind of taking here beyond
No,
maybe just trying to catch up with social trends or something.
it's well this is another aspect of the absolute monarchy that is the papacy. The the Pope wrote this to correct his own administration. His own administration a couple of years ago said something, and then he's like, "Nah, I didn't like that." So then he produced this document, and his own administration is now in the position of having to explain. It's not to get political, but it's a little bit like Joe Biden saying something off the cuff and then the press secretary being like, "Oh, our position on that hasn't changed." It's like it's the same thing. It's the same thing with this, and this is again, it gets back to the problems with an absolute monarchy, the problems with having willful personalities at the top of your organization. This kind of thing is just going to happen. Would you have you read the African bishop's response?
No, I
Yeah.
watched a video on it, but I didn't actually read the African bishop response myself.
That one is frustrating. I think it was like fine, you know, as far as a traditional response to the letter goes, it was fine. That one was particularly frustrating because Africa, the African context is that's where the gay is illegal still,
Right.
and that's where they're pushing to make it more illegal, and it's like that's a little bit of a problem for me, unironically. I'm okay. I'm okay with. I would be okay with the bishops in another place saying we are still going to withhold blessings. I kind of have a problem with the African bishops saying they're withholding blessings because I think there was an opportunity to express that yeah, gay people are people too, and that wasn't expressed.
Yeah, I do kind of find it funny that in all the places where like the secular world has largely accepted gay marriage, the church seems cool with gay marriage, and in the places where the secular governments have not recognized gay marriage, the church is not cool with gay marriage. You know what I mean? Like I find that to be like a
Well,
little bit.
I don't think that's the case really at all. We're not cool. The USCCB isn't really cool with gay marriage. I think,
It's true.
yeah, I think, but I take what you mean in terms of the cultural what is acceptable in the culture that they find themselves does tend to set the terms that the Catholic hierarchy can use. So no bishop in America is going to get away with calling for making homosexual acts illegal, for instance. I don't I
Yeah.
don't I don't I don't suspect that will ever fly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I certainly agree. Um I don't want to keep you here literally all night, but I have one more like part highlighted in your paper, and it's literally just the last couple of paragraphs. So there it is. There's the whole thing. If it's all right, I'm going to read this and ask you a couple questions about it, and then kind of just turn the whole thing over to you. But I really
Sure.
liked the ending, and in fact, I named the stream after the ending because in your very last paragraph, you
Yeah, you're
talk.
going to get me in trouble. You're going to get me in
I know, I'm so
so much
sorry.
trouble.
But it made for a good title. So I'm going to read just a few paragraphs, ask a few questions, and then hand the mic over to you. And you might need to take 15 minutes or so just to unpack
Explain
everything.
myself.
But that's fine. That's fine. Take as much time as you need. Religion is, as I said, many, many, many things. But it is definitely a technology that is supposed to make us happy, to raise the power of our being to act, to alleviate stress and anxiety, and help us to optimistically pursue our projects in the world. So many of our so-called religious truths are just these opinions about happiness above. And just as the rational person wants and works for her fellow's happiness, so too would the rational practitioner of a particular religious tradition seek to spread, quote, the good news. And yet we have trained ourselves to avoid this impulse, and in doing so have forced ourselves to pretend to be happy with a state of affairs where the others are definitionally unable to be happy given our internal logics. That is not some inert feeling, a dead and a religious impulse that has no bearing on the world. No, it trains us, bends us, causes us to, at best, simply ignore the cruelty that others suffer. What else can we do when the traditional means of overtaking competing religious faiths is not open to us? The human sense of sympathy remains. To ignore my sister and brothers in pain requires the deadening of sympathy, which is hard but can still be affected. The history of the world, and particularly the modern world, proves this. In the process, I kill my own ability to be happy. The same sensitivity to the others is precisely what allows me to discern my own good from my own bad. In short, the greatest trick Satan ever pulled was not convincing the world he didn't exist. It was taking our technologies of and for happiness and twisting them until they became engines of misery. I admit this paints a bleak picture, and I do think it is a fundamental challenge to Abrahamic and particularly Christian discourses. However, we are not without recourse. Christian solidarity has occurred and has had powerful effects. It has also been fleeting and sometimes downright evil. My hope is we can take it seriously and rationally analyze the problem. Perhaps there is a solution within the Christian conversation, and perhaps this new technology could be used to enact reconciliation with our oft maligned cousins, the fellow children of Abraham. I suspect we will need to learn from the non-monotheistic practices. Our Hindu siblings may have as much to offer us as we think we have to offer them. And a little bit of Buddhist atheism never hurt anyone, and that's where the title of this stream came. I'd like to lay out some potential candidates to fix this little problem I've created. Means and methods to involve ourselves productively in raising social consciousness, correct cruelty, and participating in each other's happiness. Incidentally, I think this can be taken as the quintessentially religious project, the fostering of a pervasive loving kindness and mutual beneficence. In a post to follow, I'll draw from these three sources: the literature dealing with the ideas around deliberative democracy, the Baha'i practice of consultation, and what might be called Pope Francis's theology of accompaniment. And that's where we end. But I absolutely love how this essay ends on the note about Catholicism and the Abrahamic religions, learning from our Hindu cousins and our Buddhist atheist cousins too. Yeah, let me just say that I found that last part to be absolutely awesome, and unironically, if that is the project of religion, then count me in. It's just that I kind of call that agnosticism, I guess. Like the idea that we might have something to learn from Hindus and Buddhists, to me, is Like that just is what agnosticism is, I guess. But it's okay with me if we don't call that agnosticism, and instead we just kind of cultivate that same practice within a religion. I think that the world would be a much better place, and I really have no no qualms with any of that. So I might have gotten you in trouble by reading that last paragraph about incorporating Hinduism and like a Buddhist atheism into Catholicism. So at this time, I'm handing the microphone over to you. What do you mean by incorporating Hinduism and Buddhist atheism into Catholicism, and why would we want to do that anyway?
Yeah, so that paragraph is the conclusion to this section, and it's written to be punchy and provocative. I have no freaking clue. That would require me studying Hinduism and studying Buddhism. I am a sophisticated enough student of religion to know that I shouldn't, describe other people's practices until I've, thoroughly taken them up. But I read a book by Evan Thompson, who's a cognitive scientist, and he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And he has an incredible amount of respect, regard, even love for Buddhist practice and the Buddhist tradition. He has a degree, I believe, in Indian philosophy, so he's pretty well traveled in that side of the world. And he makes a really excellent point where he says that he doesn't want Buddhism to be collapsed into cognitive science, and he doesn't want cognitive science to be explained using a Buddhist vocabulary. Instead, he wants a robust encounter between two different traditions that have two very different perspectives. And he's talking there the tradition of cognitive science and the tradition of Buddhism. And he's front and centering those ones because so much of cognitive science, well-meaning Buddhist apologists have identified cognitive science as the place where their religious dogmas can be empirically kind of cashed out. And Evan Thompson wants to kind of push against that because he thinks that cheapens Buddhist practice, and it's not really dealing with the scientific data properly either. And so instead he wants us to actually do Buddhism and actually do cognitive science and let those two things interact. And that's I think a necessary prerequisite to this kind of pluralism and this kind of discourse across traditions. You need to have authentic Catholics who are conversant with the tradition, sensitive to the world, and you need to have educated Hindus. I would be remiss if I didn't, pause and point out the fact that the term Hindu is not an Indian term. This is another reason why I don't really want to point to specific things. There isn't really Hinduism. There is Hinduisms.
Right.
Yeah. So at any rate, but there needs to be an authentic encounter between traditions, and it needs to start with individuals who have put on the full armor of God, so to speak, to use Christian language, but who have sheathed their swords, and earlier in this paragraph, I talk about I talk about the traditional ways of resolving religious differences are not open to us. By that I mean, earlier in this section I describe how those traditional means of dealing with religious difference was something called the Crusades, and we don't do that anymore. We don't do that. That's bad.
Much
we don't
to
like
the
that.
chagrin of certain tribes.
Yeah. It's war is bad. Like even the just war,
Right.
even a just war is very much a bad thing. So because we have committed ourselves to living peacefully with our neighbors, we need to come up with new ways of adjudicating religious differences. And the reason that I think it is important to actually adjudicate religious differences is because we use religion to figure out what it is that we need in order to be happy. And like I said earlier in this conversation, and like I say in this part of the document, that can often allow us to explain away the suffering of other people, and we just don't care about them. And I cite data to suggest that supports this idea. Specifically, in my framing, the more dogmatic, the more your religion requires a creed. That is to say, the more your religion requires you to agree to a set of propositional statements, right? The less you're interested in fixing the environment, right? And now that is beyond the scope of this paper. To rigorously argue for that would require a nuanced ability to look at the Pew Research data and actually tease that out. I work a job. I'm not an academic, but that's kind of the ground I'm standing on. And instead, what I think we need to do is we need to come up with a language which and this is, and I say that this makes us not happy because I think that many religions do tell us, and I do think this is good, many religions do tell us that love is the highest virtue, and that if you see suffering, that should affect you. Not only does it affect you because you're just an animal with a social evolutionary history, but you also recognize that as bad because of the religious upbringing and because of the religious training that you've experienced. So we need to actually care for each other, and we need to get over this these kind of stories that we tell ourselves that justify human suffering because they're not the right kind of Christian, or they're not the right kind of human, or whatever.
Amen.
I guess, and I think, when I was flirting with the Baha'i, I really did like the idea of consultation. I never really nailed down exactly what that practice was, and part of my hope of using that, that means I'm going to have to study it. I'm going to have to go figure out, is there case law involved here, or that kind of thing. Pope Francis's theology of accompaniment, that's obviously from Amoris Laetitia. I think that's where, but he uses this language throughout. He talks about accompaniment everywhere. And I think that, by the way, I think that it's borne out in social research that the way that you get people to stop believing in conspiracy theories, the way that you get people to stop being homophobic or racist, is by getting them, just by living with them, just getting them to cooperate, just to accompany them. That's it. All. And this is why I'm not really a big fan of cutting people off, of excluding people. By bringing people in, you de-radicalize them. By cutting them off, you force them to develop alternative technologies for healthcare, getting food, getting their kids educated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that just deepens divides and leads to old-fashioned war. And that's bad. So
yes. No. I thought that was all beautifully said. And what you said there at the end about accompaniment too, it speaks to me in a way, my whole channel, I don't think about the goal of my channel as being deconversion, in the slightest, but I do think about de-radicalization as a goal for my channel. 100%, I'm not apologetic about that. I want to take the very radical Catholics and I want to de-radicalize them. That is a goal of my channel. And I can't think of a better way. And now I'm not nearly as big of a Pope Francis fan. I try not to pay attention, frankly, to too much of what Pope Francis does. But I agree 100% that I think that the best way to de-radicalize people is to accompany them. I will have almost anyone on this channel. There's almost nobody that I won't talk to. And I'll let you know when I disagree with you. I'm not going to pretend like I agree with you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
no,
but
yeah,
speaking of that, There's was something I was thinking about. I watched the first 5 minutes of your conversation with the geocentrist guy,
Yeah.
and I thought that statement that he asked you to read, where he says like, you know, go read these books if you want to know more, and then there was that little addendum where he's like, I fully submit to whatever the Pope says, basically,
Yeah.
whatever the Catholic Church says. I that's another that's another thing I could talk for 30 minutes on. So I guess I'll just say that there's this kind of virtue signal within traditionally minded Catholics where they'll say something which is ridiculous, and then they'll be like, but whatever the Catholic Church says. And it's like, I don't have that move isn't available to me. Obviously, you read the thing. I don't have that move available to me. And I that's so frustrating. That's so frustrating because what do they think they've said? What do they think that they've said? To me, they seem to be using the magisterium as a tool to legitimate um, their own discourse, as opposed to using the tradition as a house to live in. Um, and that's so. You said something after you read this. You said this just reads like agnosticism to you, and I don't really care to argue too much theism, atheism, all those other things. But the thing that I think makes this not agnosticism is that I think that tradition, human tradition, and Catholic tradition in particular, is a house where people live. And I think that if religion needs to die, if it needs to go away and be replaced by something else, we can't be using wrecking balls. We have to be using surgical instruments because people live here. And there's a storehouse of human experiences that have all been oriented towards the same ideals and the same concepts for a very long time. And I think there's a credible amount of spiritual fruit that can be born by engaging with it in a very deep way. And so I don't see the magisterium as a tool to legitimize my discourse, because I think that this is something that Protestants do with proof texting, and Catholics do it with finding somebody in the tradition that said the same thing that you're saying, right? Tradition's long enough, you can find somebody who's there's Catholic socialists, right? Like I could find
Sure.
a
Yeah.
bunch if I wanted to justify voting for Bernie Sanders, I could find a bunch of quotations to justify voting for Bernie Sanders. Same for Donald Trump, right? You could go either way with it. Um, the point is that you need to be a part of the body of Christ. You need to be a part of this living organism, and I do think that requires us to leave our agnosticism at the door. I think that that practice does require us to kind of enter into the play in a more deep way.
Yeah. So let me kind of. I don't think it does require us to leave our agnosticism at the door. And the reason I say that is because I can totally imagine someone who participates. So I think that like half of the people in the pews at the trad chapel that I attended growing up were agnostics. Like I think that a lot of the people there don't really believe it, but they go because it's part of their culture. And like if you ask them if they believe it, they'd be like, "Yeah, of course I do." And then if you ask them like, how often do you think about this outside of mass on Sundays?" They'd be like, "Well, never." And if I asked them like, "Do you pay attention during the sermon on Sunday?" They'd be like, "No." You know what I mean? Like, but they go because it's part of their tradition and because it's nice to have folk heroes to look up to, right? Like the saints are just Catholic folk heroes, and like I think that those people are living in the house that tradition built for them, and those people are still kind of agnostics. Um, and
What do you mean by agnostic then?
I mean that they are people who admit that they don't really know if any of this stuff is true per se, but they're going to live as if it is anyway because they find value in living in this house that tradition built.
Yeah. Well, I do think that there's a certain propositional approach to religion which I don't think is appropriate. I think that the specific claims of religion, I don't know how to proceed this point. I think the reason I say that we need to leave our agnosticism at the door is kind of the same reason that I think you need to leave your concerns about imbalance in your training at the door when you're engaging in gym workouts for a particular sport. No soccer player is upset that his biceps aren't bigger. Um, no professional bodybuilder on the Mr. Olympia stage cares that they can't fit through, they can't fit in most sedans, right? Like nobody. So that's that's kind of what I'm talking about. Um, don't bring science into this because then you won't be happy. And I don't say that in order to give cover for people to say whatever they want. And I don't say that to give cover for uh, myth making and fantasy. The point is that, like, again, going back to the conversation at the very beginning, Exodus didn't isn't a historical event. Does that mean it didn't happen? No, actually, it's happened innumerable times because it forms the memory of a particular people who go out and they practice that liturgy in the world and so on and so forth. So I think in the laboratory we can examine the psychological aspects of religious practice, just as we can examine the psychological and physiological aspects of sport practice. But when you are on the field playing, you're not asking, but why am I not allowed to use my hands? Right?
Yeah, so I don't disagree really with like the idea that like um nobody's agnostic as to whether or not like I should be able to fit into a sedan as I'm a bodybuilder. No, like the goal is to not fit into a sedan, you know. The goal is to have to buy extra large shirts because my biceps are just that big. Like I do get that. Um However, I do think that there's like a symmetry breaker in as much as um like I don't think that the like in like the sports analogy there's like a very clear defined like set of rules, and I think with religions I feel like you can play the game without needing to think that the game is per se real, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like you can practice a religion while being agnostic. Um, is your point something like you're just not going to get as much out of it if you're agnostic? Like you
So
need to commit to the act almost.
I think my point is that I think you can be agnostic with regard to propositional statements. Is X true? Well, I don't know. Yeah, sure, that's fine. But that's not like when you're going to confession, I'm not stopping and asking myself, do I believe that the confession of these sins to this person whitens my soul, and reunites me to God and eternity and things like that? Is that true? Right? Those questions have already been answered for me because I walked in the door. Um, and I guess, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and you're going through the combat, and this is the 6th session of the campaign, and this is your 12th combat of the campaign, and somebody's like, but why does grappling require a strength check? You know, like, I don't really know what I'm saying, but I think that these questions need to be thought through prior to engaging in the practice. And but remember what I said about mystical and empirical religious knowledge. I am in no way saying that, like, we do in fact need to provide reasons for things, right? We do in fact need to provide reasons for things. We do in fact need to be responsive to the results of inquiry. Um, so I guess I'm trying to thread a needle, and I don't exactly know where the needle's going.
Can I try to like steelman your point, and I'll ask you if I have it right, and if I have it wrong, then oh well. But I tried my best. So here it is. There's a zone with D&D, and so I'll confess I've never actually played D&D, which is a shame because I'm a huge nerd. Like, I play Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. I've never played D&D, even though I know I would love it. But
Yeah.
I have a feeling that there's a zone with D&D where like, you're probably fully immersed in some sense. Like, if you've been playing with the same group of guys for a long time, and you're on the sixth, so you're well acquainted with the campaign that you're running. I imagine that there's a zone, like a D&D zone, where you are fully immersed in this adventure. And I imagine that anybody who asks, wait, but why is grappling a strength roll, is not in the zone. I imagine that if you're in the zone, you're not going to ask questions like that. And so maybe your point, and go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe your point is, if you're asking yourself, well, is God real? While you're literally next up in line for the confessional, you're not in the zone. And now you're not getting as much out of the practice of this religion as you would if you were in the zone. Is that something like what you were getting at?
Well, I think maybe a better approach, sticking with the D&D analogy, the place to ask why is grappling a strength check, and by the way, I don't actually know. I'd have to look at the rulebook if
I
it
have
is,
no idea.
but let's just say it is. It makes sense to me that it would be.
Yeah.
But anyway, um, the place to ask that is in the boardroom at the Wizards of the Coast company, Hasbro, as they're designing the rules and as they're trying to balance it against other features of the rules, and they're trying to curate the player experience, and they're trying to produce a particular catharsis, a particular set of feelings in the people who play the game. That's the place to ask the question. And I'm not against asking the question. And so when I say leaving your agnosticism at the door, it's the same way with I don't think it's appropriate in the middle of a soccer game for one of the forwards to argue with the ref that, like, you can't give me an argument why I shouldn't use my hands, so I'm going to use my hands. Yeah, so I guess that's mostly my point.
Okay.
And further, I would even say that I'm not sure to what extent the question about whether or not God exists, for instance, I'm not sure to what extent that's a whole nother can of worms.
If you want to leave that for next time, that is totally fine. I've had you, I've kept you for 2 hours now. So,
well, if you're tired of me, I can stop.
tell you what, I try to be an early to bed, early to rise kind of guy. So why don't we do this? Why don't I? So the proverbial last question is always like, where can we find you and stuff like that. Instead of just asking you, where can we find you, I'm going to ask you if there's one message that you could leave Trent Horn specifically.
Ooh.
What message would that be? And where can we find you and all that, if you want to share any of that.
Like we've been saying, I don't know Trent Horn's psychology. I don't know what he would be most responsive to. I just hope that he stops. I hope he stops doing that at some point in the future. I think for my part, I think it's ironic that I'm coming to a YouTube channel to talk in this way, because I think that YouTube religious practice is huge. It's varied. There's all kinds of different religious practices. And religious practice on YouTube is basically centered around apologetics and counter apologetics. And that is, I think there are certain questions that are vital that we figure out and we get out of the way. There are certain questions that we're just never going to get out of the way. I really like this bit from John Hicks' book that I read, where he was talking about how he was examining all these different arguments for and against God, and his point is that the universe is fundamentally ambiguous. I don't actually agree with him. I think that the universe tips towards naturalism. I don't think that the universe is ambiguous, but I think that he makes a good point that you can theoretically put together a rational defense of whatever you want. What I would like us to do is to be sensitive to why. Why is it that you're defending this terrain? Be sensitive to the story. Be sensitive to the history that led to this moment. Why do you adopt these beliefs? Why do you think these beliefs need to be defended? And hopefully that education, that historical lesson, will get you to focus in on the contingency of these religious systems. And you'll start to understand that the most important part of our religious practice is not the propositions and whether or not the Shroud of Turin is real or Fatima is real. The point of this religious practice is to have the Psalms, with us through thick and thin, is to have the person of Jesus Christ, who is living in the Eucharistic practice of the Catholic Church, for instance, be present with us, be with us while we're making those 1,000 minor decisions throughout the day, which will add up to either heaven or hell on this planet. And we are to contribute to the happiness of the people that are in our lives. We are to contribute to the justice that our democracies are seeking to instantiate in the world. And our religious practice, our liturgical practice can be a big, big help for us in that regard. If we let them, if we get out of our own way, if we stop with this bullshit rationalization, Thomistic certainty nonsense, and just practice like the ancient Israelites did, practice like the first Christians did, and so on and so forth. That said, I also don't mean to make an appeal to the original Christianity. I think that concept's very, very fraught, but I do want to use the religious language. I do want us to be open to the reviving power of the Holy Spirit.
I think that's an awesome note to end on. I haven't been pulling up a whole bunch of the chat, but I just want to let you know that the chat has been very lively tonight. And so
Oh, no.
Gloff from earlier, he says that and keep in mind, Gloff is, and Gloff, I don't think that you would take offense if I said this, a very traditional Catholic in the sense, like not in the trad Cath, but in the like just a very well-informed kind of an Orthodox Catholic, I think is a very good way of saying it. An Orthodox Catholic who will attend the Novus Ordo and attend a traditional Latin Mass. That's a good way to describe Gloff. He says he doesn't agree with Matthew on quite a bit, but he's a very interesting thinker. And the rest of the chat, essentially, poor Gloff was like the only Orthodox Catholic in the chat tonight. But the rest of the chat was saying that they
And to
really...
be
And Scooby thinks
to be
that
clear,
Trent's about to make
no. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And to be clear, I do want there to be. I pray out of the same psalter as my grandfather. This one that I've held up as I shouldn't use the word of God as a prop. It just happens to be here on top of my bullet journal because I take it with me. But I actually have my grandfather's psalter, you know, I want us, and I read the encyclicals. I want us to authentically engage, just as I said with regards to what Evan Thompson says. I want us to be uh, good cognitive scientists and slash or good Buddhists, but not reading the one in the terms of the other. So I do want to be a better Catholic. I do want to be responsive. When I say that I am a Catholic, what I mean is I am responsive to a particular tradition. Um, that's where I need to go to see how I, you know, how I talk about things and how I think about things.
Cool. Matthew, this conversation today has been awesome. We opened a lot of cans of worms, and I think that we closed a decent number of them, but definitely not all. So I would love to have you back on, and we can open up a whole bunch more cans of worms next time if you ever want to. But this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to the next time we get to do this.
Thanks for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, until next time.